Hello and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're doing something I've been sitting on for a while, and I'm genuinely glad we're finally here. We're not doing a season ranking, we're not going through plot holes. I've got a whole separate video on that if that's more your speed, and it is a good time. And we're not here to Relaxate the Season 8 finale, though I do have thoughts, and at some point we'll have that conversation. No, tonight the idea is simpler, and honestly, a bit stranger than any of those things. Tonight, we're going to sit with Dexter as a show that somewhat accidentally contains some of the more quietly honest observations about human nature that I've encountered in a long-form drama. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the kind of thing you say about a prestige show on a streaming platform, not about a Showtime thriller where the protagonist wraps people in plastic film and delivers monologues about his feelings in a Miami accent. And yet, here we are. I've been rewatching the whole franchise recently. The original 8 seasons, New Blood, and Original Sin. And something kept happening that didn't happen when I first watched it years ago. I kept pausing, not because I'd forgotten what was coming, but because something the show was doing landed differently than I expected. A line of internal monologue, a small character choice, a moment in a flashback that seemed to reach outside the frame and be about something else entirely. Something that felt true in the way fiction occasionally manages to feel true when it's not actively trying to. So that's what tonight is. We're going to go through the whole story loosely, and I'm going to point at the moments where I think Dexter stumbled onto something worth keeping. Some of these are things the writers clearly intended. Others, I think, came out sideways. Truths that snuck into the script while everyone was busy constructing a thriller. There's a lot of ground to cover, so settle in. This is a long one. If you're watching this the way I imagine most people watch this kind of thing, lying down, lights low or off, letting it wash over you, then good, that's exactly what it's made for. No urgency, no final destination we're racing towards. We're just going to move through this together at whatever pace feels comfortable. And if you're new here and you'd like to subscribe, that does help more than you might think. But truly, no pressure. Get comfortable and let's get into it. One small framing note before we start. Most of what we're going to talk about tonight draws on the original series, seasons 1 through 8, with significant time spent on New Blood, and some reference to Original Sin where it illuminates things. If you haven't seen all of those, fair warning, we're going to move through the whole story, including the endings. This is very much that kind of video, so if you're mid-rewatch and trying to stay unspoiled, perhaps save this one for when you're through. But if you've seen it, if you've sat with this franchise in any form, then I think you'll find something here worth keeping. And I want to be honest about something at the start. This isn't a video that's going to tell you Dexter is secretly profound in the way that changes how you think about television. It's a video about a show that, in the course of being an entertaining thriller, kept bumping into certain truths about human nature that feel more broadly true than the specific context of a serial killer in Miami. Not every season. Some seasons are just a serial killer in Miami. But enough of it, often enough to make it worth looking at closely. That's the promise. Let's see if I can make it good. The first episode of Dexter opens with a voiceover that is one of the more quietly strange introductions in television, and I've thought about it more than I probably should. Dexter Morgan is driving through Miami at night. He's just killed someone, efficiently, cleanly, without apparent distress. And what he tells us over the top of it, in a voice that is calm and almost pleasant, is this. My name is Dexter, Dexter Morgan. I don't know what made me the way I am, but whatever it was left a hollow place inside. People fake a lot of human interactions, but I feel like I fake them all, and I fake them very well. That's my burden, I suppose. And then the titles come up and we're off. The thing is, I've heard variations of that opening sentiment from people who are not serial killers, not the killing part, obviously. But the rest of it, the sense of performing normalcy, of moving through social interactions that feel slightly outside yourself, of there being some part of your interior life that you keep in a separate room and never quite let anyone see. I don't know what made me the way I am. I fake them all, and I fake them very well. The show calls that interior thing the dark passenger, which is a bit theatrical as names go. In the first season particularly, it's treated with some reverence. This deep, primordial force that lives inside Dexter and demands to be fed. Later seasons complicate it considerably, and New Blood in particular does interesting things with what happens when you suppress the dark passenger for long enough without examining it. But the metaphor, stripped of its dramatic framing, is actually fairly simple. It's the part of yourself you don't introduce at dinner parties. The impulse, the resentment, the desire, the version of your personality that you've decided is not fit for public consumption. The thing you keep in the separate room. Everyone has something in that room. Dexter's version just happens to be considerably more alarming than most. What I've always thought the show understood from its very first scene is that it wasn't asking you to empathize with a killer. It was asking you to recognize the shape of an experience, the performance of normalcy, the maintenance of a surface, the low-grade exhaustion of being two things at once. And it was presenting that experience through a lens extreme enough to make it visible. If the show had been about someone who was slightly anxious and kept his real feelings hidden at work, you'd recognize nothing in particular. You'd dismiss it as mild and move on. But wrapped in Miami and plastic wrap and police procedural, somehow it gets through. And what the franchise returns to, across every season and every continuation, is the same question. What do you do with the parts of yourself you didn't choose and can't remove? Not in the abstract. What do you do with them practically on a Tuesday when they're there? That question runs underneath everything we're going to talk about tonight. There's a secondary thread to this lesson that I find worth mentioning. Dexter, for all his internal monologue about being empty and hollow and incapable of real feeling, is plainly not those things. He loves Deborah, he grieves Rita, he agonizes about Harrison, he forms genuine attachments and feels real losses. The running self-description of hollowness is itself a kind of performance, one that Dexter delivers to himself as much as to anyone else, which is its own interesting thing. The story we tell about what we're capable of feeling sometimes becomes the limiting frame through which we see what we're actually feeling. That tension between how Dexter describes himself and who he demonstrably actually is one I'll keep coming back to. For now, the main point is this. The dark passenger works as a metaphor because it points at something real, the gap between the self we present and the self we live with. And Dexter is a show that stares directly into that gap for the entirety of its run and asks what's actually there. There's one more thing worth saying about the dark passenger before we move on, and it's something the show gestures at without always fully developing. The maintenance of a double life, the performance of an acceptable self over a concealed interior one, is exhausting in a very specific way. Not dramatic exhaustion, not the kind you can point to and name, the kind that comes from never quite being in the same room as yourself, from the persistent low-level energy cost of monitoring the gap between what you're showing and what you're actually experiencing. Dexter's voiceover is, in one reading, an attempt to close that gap, to have some space, even if only internal, where both things exist simultaneously and without judgment. He can't say any of it out loud to anyone, so he says it to himself and to us. And there's something in that which resonates with a lot of people who don't share any of Dexter's more alarming qualities. The relief of the internal monologue, the space that is genuinely your own. I've always thought the voiceover is the most personal element of the show more than any specific plot development. It's the architecture of a private self. And Michael C. Hall delivers it throughout the entire run with a consistency and texture that is genuinely remarkable. It never becomes routine. It keeps feeling like you're actually hearing someone think. Since we're on the topic of things Dexter didn't choose, there's someone who shaped him before he had any say in the matter and who deserves to be looked at carefully. Harry Morgan is one of the more quietly complicated figures in this franchise, and I think he deserves to be looked at slowly rather than summarized. The basic facts are these. Harry was a Miami Metro homicide detective who adopted a small boy named Dexter following a crime scene in which Dexter was found sitting in a pool of his mother's blood. He recognized early on that there was something in Dexter that wasn't quite like other children. The violent urges were present, the capacity for harm was visible, even in a young boy. And rather than seek professional help or psychiatric assessment, or candidly tell anyone at all about what he'd observed, Harry made a private decision. He would teach the boy to channel those urges. He would create a code, a set of rules. You only kill killers. You obtain certainty before acting. And above all, you don't get caught. The Code of Harry, the entire franchise, original series, New Blood, Original Sin, Resurrection, all of it hangs off that one private decision made by one Miami cop decades before the show begins. And I find the code genuinely fascinating because it's not a bad code viewed in isolation. Think about what it actually contains: a commitment to only targeting people who have caused serious harm to others, a requirement for certainty before acting, evidence, not suspicion, and a deep emphasis on concealment that, whatever else you might say about it, was designed to keep Dexter alive and functioning in a world that had no category for what he was. Harry's logic, at its core, made a kind of sense. He believed he was looking at something that couldn't be untaught, so he taught it sideways. But Season 2 does something that reframes everything you've understood about Harry up to that point. Captain Matthews discloses, in a conversation that is easy to miss if you're watching casually, that Harry didn't die from heart disease. He died from a deliberate overdose, a suicide. The official cause was buried to protect the family. And the reason, the actual reason, which takes a further beat to emerge, was that Harry had walked in on Dexter in the middle of a kill. He saw, for the first time with adult eyes and not the filtered version he'd constructed in his mind, what he had built. And he couldn't live with what he saw, which changes everything about the code. Because Harry didn't build a framework for Dexter's benefit purely. He built a framework that served his own need to believe that what he'd done had been good, that he hadn't trained a killer, that there was a noble architecture to it, a moral purpose, a design, a contribution to justice. The code was, in significant measure, about Harry's ability to look at himself in the mirror. And the moment the mirror showed him the full picture, the code wasn't enough. Most of us don't have a code of Harry in our lives, but most of us are running by something inherited, some framework absorbed from a parent or a community or a culture, taken in before we were old enough to evaluate it properly, before we had the tools to ask where it came from, what it was protecting when it was originally built, and whether any of that still applies. The code kept Dexter functional for decades. It also kept him from examining who he actually was beneath it. Those two things coexisted right up until they couldn't anymore. And there's a detail about Harry that I keep coming back to. He visited Dexter in flashbacks across the whole series. The show used those flashbacks extensively as a framing device. Harry as a guiding voice, a moral anchor, a reference point. In life, Harry trained Dexter and then was destroyed by what he saw. In memory, Harry became exactly what Dexter needed him to be: steady, wise, principled. Memory has a way of editing towards the version that serves us. Dexter carried a Harry that was considerably more perfect than the Harry that existed, which raises a question worth sitting with quietly. How much of the code you're living by right now is based on an edited version of where it came from? And there's a related question: how much of it was actually designed for you versus designed to address the needs and anxieties of the person who handed it to you? That distinction matters because a code designed for someone else's needs might not be the right one for yours, even if it's functional, even if it served you well, even if the person who built it loved you genuinely. Harry loved Dexter. The code still had elements that were about Harry's peace of mind as much as Dexter's well-being. Both things were true simultaneously. Original Sin, the prequel series set in 1991, adds an interesting layer to all of this. It shows us Harry in the process of building the code. Younger, uncertain, making decisions in real time with incomplete information and genuine emotional investment. He's not the composed mentor of the flashbacks. He's a man trying to figure out what to do about his adopted son and getting it partly right and partly wrong in the way that parents usually get things. The prequel humanizes the origin story in ways that the retrospective flashbacks couldn't quite manage. And what it shows, interestingly, is that Harry's own doubts were present from the beginning. He wasn't confident about the code. He was improvising from a position of love and anxiety, building something that seemed to be working without knowing whether it would hold. That's how most frameworks get built, not from certainty, but from necessity, by people who were doing their best with what they had. That doesn't make the code wrong, or Harry culpable, or Dexter's eventual reckoning with it a betrayal. It just makes it human. Built by a person, shaped by that person's limits, worth examining with that knowledge in hand. What's also worth noting about Harry is the weight of the concealment he maintained alongside the code. He didn't just keep Dexter's secret from the world, he kept parts of it from Dexter himself: the suicide, the full story of Vogel's involvement, the degree to which Harry's peace of mind was intertwined with the code's design. Dexter lived for years with an edited version of his own origin, and Harry chose to provide that edition, not out of cruelty. Out of the same thing that drives most concealments, the belief that the other person would be better served by not knowing. That belief is sometimes correct, and sometimes it leaves someone in the dark about themselves for decades. And now, the question of what happens when someone who never had a Harry makes entirely different choices with the same raw material. Brian Moser doesn't get talked about enough. He's the villain of Season 1, the ice truck killer. And a lot of the discussion around the first season is about the craft of his reveal, the elegance of the staging, the way the show walked you right up to the answer and then showed it to you in a way that felt both surprising and completely inevitable. All of that is fair. But I'm more interested in what Brian Moser means than in how his reveal was constructed. He and Dexter were both present the day their mother Laura was killed in a cargo container in 1973. They were both very young. They both sat in the blood for days before anyone found them. The same event, the same origin point, the same wound. And they became completely different people. Dexter has a code. He has guilt, more than he'll admit. He has genuine affection for Deborah. He wants, in his strange and incomplete way, to connect with the world around him. Brian has none of those things. He's elegant and intelligent and quietly, thoroughly empty in a way that Dexter, for all his protestations of hollowness, simply isn't. He targets women and removes their blood entirely, staging the scenes with an aesthetic precision that is almost meditative in its calm. Bloodless, pristine, carefully composed, which is, I've always thought, a subconscious echo of their mother's death. She was found drained of blood, and Brian recreates that condition endlessly, but makes it controlled. Deliberate rather than chaotic. His crimes are, in some horrible way, an attempt to master the moment that broke him. The show asks, implicitly, what made them different, and the answer it offers is Harry. Harry found Dexter in that container and made a choice to stay with him. To shape what he found rather than abandon it to the system, Brian went into foster care, moved around, had no one to perform that shaping function. He grew into someone with no framework and no attachment to the world. Not because the wound was deeper, the wound was identical, but the scaffolding around it was absent. Same trauma, different outcomes. And the difference was the relationship that came after. This is the kind of thing that sounds straightforward when you say it plainly. The environment around a wound matters as much as the wound itself. What surrounds the damage shapes what the damage becomes. But the show earns this because it actually puts both outcomes in the same frame. Brian and Dexter, face to face in the Season 1 finale, are not a good person and a bad person. They're the same person who went through different doors. And one of the most quietly devastating details of that finale is that Dexter chooses Deborah over Brian. He chooses his adoptive sister, Azem, the relationship that was constructed, the connection that was built through time and care and choice, over his biological brother, his original blood connection. He kills Brian and stages it as a suicide. He goes home. That's not a small thing. That's Dexter choosing Harry's world over the alternative. Choosing the framework, the code, the relationship, over the thing that preceded all of that. And everything that follows in the show is built on that choice. Here's a small detail worth mentioning since we're on the topic of how the ice truck killer operated. Within the fiction of the show, his crimes were praised by other investigators for their staging. There's a dark irony in the fact that the precision of those scenes, the care, the aesthetic control, was being quietly admired by the one person in the building who understood, on a cellular level, exactly where it came from and what it meant. There's something else about the Brian Moser storyline that I find worth sitting with, which is what it implies about the foster care system in a broader sense. Brian's trajectory, no Harry, no framework, no sustained attachment to anyone who gave a genuine damn about what he was becoming, is presented as the explanation for why he turned out differently, which is true within the show's logic. But it also quietly indicts a system that was supposed to be providing precisely that function. A child who needed specific help and got none. An outcome that was, in some sense, preventable. The show doesn't dwell on this. It's a thriller, not a policy documentary. But the implication is there in the comparison. The difference between Dexter and Brian isn't a difference of nature. It's a difference of what the world provided to both of them after the same terrible starting point. That's worth sitting with, even briefly. There's also something worth noting about how the show handles the aftermath of Brian's death, specifically how completely it moves past it. The ice truck killer, who was Dexter's biological brother, who shared his origin, who represented the version of Dexter that Harry didn't find in time, he's gone by the season 1 finale and barely mentioned thereafter. The show chose not to linger, which is, in a way, its own statement. Some doors you close, and then you live forward from there and the door stays closed. Not because it wasn't significant, because some things can't be revisited without reopening them. Dexter chose Deborah, he closed the Brian door. And the choice itself is the story. And now, talking a bit about what happens when the thing you're hiding starts to attract attention from the people around you. Season 2 is, among other things, the season where you get the most direct examination of how concealment actually works in practice, and what it costs. Here's the situation at the start of Season 2. Divers off the coast of Miami discover a collection of garbage bags containing human remains, 50+ bodies. Dexter's underwater graveyard disturbed. The Bay Harbor butcher case is born. The FBI arrive in the form of Frank Lundy, who is genuinely sharp, notably, one of the more competent investigators the show produces. And suddenly the entire investigative apparatus of Miami Metro is pointed, however obliquely, in Dexter's direction. And what you watch across that season is a fairly precise study in the geometry of concealment. Because a secret doesn't just require you to hide the original thing, it requires you to maintain a consistent story about your whereabouts, your timeline, your behavior. It requires you to monitor other people's proximity to the truth in real time. It requires you to be several steps ahead of every conversation that might edge towards the real version of events. And when someone new gets close, Lundy, who is methodical, or Dokes, who is closing the distance at a pace that becomes genuinely alarming, you need to introduce new elements to redirect them, which creates new exposure, which requires new management, which generates new complications. It compounds. That's the right word for it. Each layer of concealment doesn't just add to the weight, it multiplies it. The original secret doesn't get heavier on its own, but the infrastructure required to maintain it keeps expanding, and infrastructure has a way of failing in unexpected places. The NA storyline is the cleanest illustration of this in miniature. Dexter needs a cover story for his suspicious behavior, and the story he settles on, that he's a drug addict in recovery, is practically reasonable. It explains absences, mood shifts, secretive behavior, it's coherent, and it immediately introduces Lila West into his life, which is about as far from a low-profile development as it's possible to get. Lila sees Dexter clearly, not the full picture, not yet, but more than anyone else in that moment. And the relationship that develops is exactly as unstable as you'd expect when someone chooses, for reasons of concealment, to get close to a person whose primary quality is that she doesn't accept surfaces. She's attracted to what she senses underneath. She will not stop pulling at the thread. To be fair, Dexter doesn't choose Lila exactly. She chooses him with considerable force and persistence. But the point stands, the cover story opened a door that needed to remain closed, and it opened it to precisely the kind of person who would keep pushing it wider. By the end of Season 2, Dokes is framed as the Bay Harbor butcher and killed in a cabin explosion that Lila orchestrates. Lila is dealt with in Paris, the investigation closes. Dexter survives the season intact, but he survives having committed several new acts he wouldn't have needed to commit if the original graveyard hadn't been disturbed, and having acquired new vulnerabilities in the process of defending against the old ones. The secret being threatened didn't just endanger the past, it generated the present. That's how concealment works at a certain scale. The cost of maintenance becomes greater than the cost of the original problem. I think most people have experienced a version of this in smaller forms. Not with FBI investigations, obviously, but the shape of it. One concealment creating conditions that require another and another, until you're spending more energy maintaining something than you ever intended to invest in it at the start. That's recognizable. The cover story that took on a life of its own. The version of events that required a supporting cast of other versions. There's a moment in Season 2 during the Dokes storyline that I find particularly interesting. Dexter has Dokes trapped in a cage in the Everglades and is genuinely weighing whether to kill him. And Dokes says something that stops him. They never told you. with reference to Harry, a secret within a secret. The implication that there's something Dexter doesn't know about his own history. Dexter drops the plan and starts asking questions, which is its own small lesson in the middle of a larger one. Secrets don't just protect the person keeping them, they define the person who's kept in the dark. And sometimes the most significant concealments are the ones you don't know are happening. I also want to give Frank Lundy proper credit here because he gets undervalued in most discussions of Season 2. He's the most competent investigator Dexter encounters across the whole franchise. Methodical, patient, not susceptible to the social manipulations that usually redirect suspicion away from Dexter. He follows procedure and it leads him somewhere real. The Bay Harbor Butcher case doesn't close because Lundy made a mistake. It closes because Dokes died and the case resolved in a way that satisfied institutional requirements, not because Lundy ran out of legitimate reasons to keep looking. He returns in Season 4 briefly, still pursuing threads, still not entirely satisfied with how the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation concluded. He's shot and killed before he can get anywhere, which is, in its way, the show's most honest acknowledgement of what it takes to stop a genuinely good investigator, not outsmarting them, just removing them. And there's something appropriately bleak in that, which the show deserves credit for acknowledging. Season 2 also gives us Lila West, who deserves a moment of her own. She's often discussed primarily as a villain, the unhinged sponsor who becomes obsessed with Dexter, who frames Batista for rape, who eventually blows up a cabin to kill Dokes and then comes for Dexter in Paris. All of that is accurate. But Lila, before she's a villain, is something more interesting. She's the first person in the show who actively pursues Dexter's real self rather than his performance. She's drawn to the concealment rather than threatened by it. She wants what's underneath. And for a few episodes, this is genuinely destabilizing for Dexter, not in a threatening way, in the way of suddenly being seen by someone who seems to welcome what they're seeing. The relationship becomes toxic, and the show makes that clear. But the initial pull is real, and it points at something the franchise keeps returning to. The hunger to be actually known is significant enough that it overrides quite a lot of reasonable judgment about who is doing the knowing and what they want from it. We covered this in the Miguel section. Lila is an earlier, more extreme version of the same dynamic. The person who sees you and doesn't recoil can become the person who consumes you. And the seeing is what makes you stay long enough for the consuming to begin. Season 3 doesn't get the attention that Seasons 1, 2, or 4 do, which I think is slightly unfair. It does something that the other seasons don't quite do in the same way. It gives Dexter a friend. Miguel Prado enters the picture because of an accident. Dexter is in the middle of killing a man named Fribo when Oscar Prado, Miguel's younger brother, arrives unexpectedly and is killed in the chaos. It's not planned. Oscar wasn't the target. And the fallout from that accident puts Dexter in close orbit with Miguel, who is an assistant district attorney, politically connected, charming, and, as becomes apparent fairly quickly, carrying his own appetite for extrajudicial violence that he has been keeping rather quiet. The friendship that develops is, in its early stages, genuinely warm, or at least it feels that way. Miguel is smart and engaging and full of energy, and when he learns the full truth about Dexter, which happens earlier in the season than you might expect, his response isn't horror or recoil, it's recognition, something that reads as genuine understanding. And Dexter, for maybe the first time, experiences something he hasn't had before. The sense of being actually known by someone, which is where it starts to get complicated. Because what Miguel actually is, what he reveals himself to be slowly and then all at once, is someone who wanted access to Dexter's capability for his own entirely separate purposes. The code meant nothing to him from the start. The rule about only targeting killers was never going to contain him. He uses what Dexter showed him to murder a defense attorney he finds professionally inconvenient. He's not a reluctant vigilante who got carried away. He's an opportunist who cultivated a friendship specifically to gain access to a useful tool. And the thing that stays with me about this storyline is that the friendship wasn't entirely performed. The show is careful about this, and I think it's right to be. There are moments between Miguel and Dexter that aren't cynical. Dinners, conversations, small gestures of genuine warmth. Miguel liked Dexter. I believe that about the character. He just liked having access to Dexter's particular capability more than he liked Dexter. and those two things coexisted, right up until they couldn't. The lesson here, if you want to call it that, is about the distinction between being seen and being used. Because they can coexist. Someone can understand you fairly clearly, can perceive the thing you normally hide, can offer the recognition you've been quietly hungry for, and still be relating to you primarily in terms of what you can provide. Being known doesn't automatically mean being loved. It doesn't even automatically mean being respected. And the most isolating version of that experience is when you've let someone close specifically because the understanding seemed real, and then you discover the understanding was the vector, not the goal. Dexter kills Miguel in the end. He doesn't have much choice at that point. Miguel has become an active liability and a genuine danger, but the show does something I appreciate. It gives that kill a specific quality that distinguishes it from Dexter's other kills. There's a grief to it. Not just the tactical management of a threat, the closing of a door that briefly appeared to lead somewhere genuinely good. There's an additional dimension to the Miguel storyline that I find worth sitting with, which is what it suggests about the specific hunger for being known. Dexter has spent his entire adult life maintaining a surface. He's very good at it. The surface is convincing. But surfaces are, by definition, not the thing they're covering, and there's a cost to being the person behind the surface, which is a kind of chronic loneliness that comes from never being really present with another person, from always being slightly elsewhere, performing, managing. Miguel offered something that appeared to address that loneliness, not the surface, but the actual thing underneath it. Recognition, and the hunger for recognition, especially for someone who has been denied it for as long as Dexter has, is significant enough to override quite a lot of reasonable caution. That's the mechanism the show is identifying in Season 3. Not naivety exactly, not stupidity. A specific and understandable vulnerability. The desire to be seen by someone who seems to see you, overriding the equally legitimate question of whether the seeing is benevolent. Those two things, being accurately perceived and being safely regarded, can come apart. Miguel demonstrates that they can come apart dramatically. And then Season 3 closes with something that sets up everything that follows. Rita is pregnant, Dexter proposes. The show is deliberately expanding his world, giving him more to lose, more attachment to manage, more reason to stay, and more reason to fear what staying means. Since we're on the topic of reasons to fear, there's a character coming in Season 4 who embodies the specific danger of admiring the wrong person, and I want to give that proper space. Arthur Mitchell. The Trinity Killer, probably the best antagonist in the franchise's history, and that's a sentence I'm comfortable defending even against strong competition. John Lithgow's performance is extraordinary, and part of what makes it extraordinary is that Arthur isn't presented as a monster from the opening frame. He's presented as a solution. Here's the context. Season 4 opens with Dexter newly married to Rita, with a newborn son, Harrison, and 2 stepchildren, Astor and Cody. He's exhausted. He's struggling. The two halves of his life keep colliding in ways he can't manage. A screaming baby and a kill schedule, a wife who needs his presence, and a dark passenger that demands its own kind of attention. He's not managing it well. The myth that he'd be able to compartmentalize the two worlds is already showing its cracks. And then he crosses paths with Arthur Mitchell, apparently a devoted family man, a pillar of his community, a church deacon who builds homes for the unhoused, who has somehow, impossibly, been an active serial killer for 30 years without detection. A man who appears to have solved the problem that Dexter is struggling with in real time. What Dexter sees in Arthur is proof. Proof that it can be done, that you can be both, the family life and the dark passenger, the husband and the monster, the coached youth sports and the kill room, and not have it collapse. And Dexter is so hungry for that proof that he delays killing Arthur. He keeps him alive. He watches him. He tries to understand how Arthur manages the architecture of it. And what he finds, slowly and then with terrible clarity, is that Arthur has managed nothing, has solved nothing. The family life that looked like stability was built on decades of psychological cruelty and fear. His wife and children were not living well behind closed doors. They were surviving. They had learned to absorb the damage and keep moving. The deacon who built houses for strangers destroyed the people he came home to every night. The perfect family man was, underneath the careful surface, a person who had been recreating the trauma of his own childhood through ritualistic murder for 3 decades and taking everyone near him down in the undertow. The Trinity Killer's murders followed a specific 3-part cycle: a bathtub, a fall, and entombing, each stage corresponding to a trauma from his own past. He wasn't transcending his history through those killings. He was recreating it over and over with different people in the same sequence. The murders weren't an escape from what had happened to him. They were what had happened to him on an endless loop. And Dexter, in his admiration for what Arthur appeared to be, kept him alive long enough for Arthur to find Rita. I don't want to rush past what happens at the end of season 4 because the show earned its reputation with those final minutes. Dexter kills Arthur in the finale. He kills him having finally understood what Arthur actually was. And then he goes home. He finds Rita in the bathtub. He finds Harrison on the floor. He stands there with his phone in his hand, and the season ends. The show is clear about the causation. The admiration was the mistake. Not just the tactical decision to keep Arthur alive for reasons of observation, but the underlying error. Looking at someone who appeared to have what you wanted and projecting backwards from the surface to a story that wasn't there. Arthur looked like evidence that a certain kind of life was possible. He was actually evidence of the opposite. I find this worth sitting with at some length because I think most people have done some version of this, not with serial killers, but with the broader pattern. Identifying someone who seems to have solved a problem you're struggling with, and borrowing the idea of their life without knowing what the reality of it looks like from the inside. The person who seems to balance everything, the person who appears to have figured out the thing you can't figure out. The surface reads as proof. The interior, if you ever got near enough to see it, might read very differently. Admiration at a distance is frequently misidentification in disguise. Arthur Mitchell is the show's most extreme demonstration of that, but it's not its only one. There's something else about Arthur's arc that the show does well, which is showing the specific mechanism of Dexter's delay. He doesn't keep Arthur alive because he's incompetent or reckless. He keeps him alive because he's genuinely learning from him. Or thinks he is. He's taking notes, observing how the family dynamic works, attending Arthur's church, following him through his routines. It's research, and the research produces conclusions that seem legitimate, right up until they don't. In any real situation, which this obviously isn't, let's be clear, that kind of prolonged observation is dangerous for reasons beyond the obvious, because the longer you study someone from a distance, the more the interpretation fills in the gaps. You don't have access to the interior, you have the exterior, and you build a story about what the interior must be based on what the exterior suggests. And that story can become convincing enough that it overrides the evidence that contradicts it when it eventually appears. Arthur's family showed Dexter evidence that contradicted the story: his wife's anxiety, his son's fear, the specific quality of tension in that household that didn't fit the deacon who builds homes exterior. Dexter noticed it. He categorized it as something manageable. He kept watching. That's the thing about idealization. It's not that you stop receiving information, it's that the information gets processed through the frame you've already built, and the frame has enough solidity by that point to absorb contradictions without updating. You see what you've decided to see for longer than you should. There's one more dimension to the season 4 ending that I want to sit with, which is what happens to Dexter in the weeks after Rita's death. The show doesn't skip past this. The early episodes of season 5 spend real time on what guilt and grief look like in Dexter's particular emotional register, which is different from the conventional version, but no less real. He tells Harrison at one point, "Lucky to have me, I wouldn't say so. She trusted me, and now she's dead." And later, "I'm toxic, you'd all be better off without me." These are not performances. This is Dexter genuinely reckoning, for one of the few times in the show's run, with the mathematics of what his existence costs the people near him. He's not constructing a narrative to manage the grief. He's just sitting in it, briefly, before the thriller momentum of season 5 pulls him forward. That moment, a man at a table telling his infant son that he's toxic, meaning it, is among the most unguarded things the show ever lets Dexter be. And it's a direct consequence of admiring the wrong person. Arthur Mitchell didn't just take Rita, he showed Dexter in the most brutal possible way what Dexter's own choices had enabled. The last image of season 4 is not Arthur Mitchell, it's not Dexter on the phone, it's Harrison. Harrison Morgan, Dexter and Rita's infant son, sitting in the bath in a shallow pool of his mother's blood. Rita dead, Harrison's expression, still, present, uncomprehending, and the camera holds on it long enough for you to understand what it's telling you. That this is how Dexter's own life started. That the thing Dexter survived in 1973 has reproduced itself in his home in 2009, the cycle closing. There's no dialogue in that moment. There doesn't need to be. The show makes its argument with an image. I've always thought this is the emotional center of the entire franchise. Not season 4 specifically. The whole thing, everything in New Blood makes its case precisely because of this image. Harrison's arc, the violence, the confusion about who he is and what his impulses mean, the dark passenger he discovers in himself as a teenager. All of it traces directly back to this moment. He doesn't have a conscious memory of it. He was an infant. But it's in him anyway. There's a concept that comes up in discussions of intergenerational trauma. The idea that children inherit not just what their parents did, but what happened to their parents. The shape of the wound transfers, even when the specific memory doesn't. Harrison never knew his mother. He barely knew his father for most of his life. And yet he arrived in Iron Lake already pulled toward darkness, already confused by impulses he couldn't name, already dealing with a gap between who he appeared to be and what he was actually experiencing. That gap didn't come from nothing, it came from something. The show doesn't need to make this explicit, and mostly it doesn't. It trusts the image. What I find most affecting about this thread is what it implies about the limits of intention. Dexter never meant for Harrison to be in that bathtub. The risk he accepted in maintaining his double life was, in his framing, a risk he accepted on behalf of himself, his own exposure, his own potential consequences. He genuinely believed, I think, that he was protecting his family by keeping his two worlds separated. And the moment the walls between them failed, the first person to pay the price was the smallest, least capable of paying it, most innocent of anything. We hurt people we never meant to reach. More on that in a bit. For now, what I want to hold on to from this lesson is something fairly simple. Patterns aren't contained by their originator. Dexter's particular history, the container, the blood, the dissociative numbness that followed, didn't stay with Dexter, it moved. It showed up in the next generation wearing slightly different clothes. And Harrison's entire arc is the story of whether a pattern that has been moving forward for decades can at some point be stopped. New Blood's answer to that question is bleak and honest in equal measure. But we'll get there. There's something else worth saying here before we move on. The season 4 finale is often discussed in terms of its dramatic impact, the shock of it, the devastation of it, the way it resets everything you thought you understood about where the show was going. All of that is accurate. But what I think gets undervalued in those discussions is the specificity of the image. It's not just something terrible happened to Dexter's family. It's that exact image. The blood on the tile, the baby in the shallow water, the stillness of it. Because the show spent 4 years establishing that Dexter's origin, the container, the bodies, the blood, the days of sitting in it as a small child, was the formative wound. The thing that cracked something open in him that couldn't be repaired. And then it shows you the same wound reproduced in his own home with his own son. The message is not subtle, but it doesn't need to be. Some things need to be stated plainly. What I find most affecting about this, if I'm allowed to be slightly personal for a moment, is the implication about effort. Dexter tried. Whatever you think of his choices and methods and the harm he caused, he tried to build a life that wouldn't replicate what had happened to him. He built a family, he showed up at Harrison's school interviews, he cooked dinners, he maintained, imperfectly and at considerable personal cost, the shape of a normal life. And none of that trying was sufficient to stop the pattern from completing itself. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. It implies a limit on what intention can accomplish, a gap between trying and succeeding that can't always be closed by trying harder. Some patterns are older and more powerful than the individual carrying them. They need something more than good intentions to interrupt. New Blood takes that implication seriously. The whole of Harrison's arc is built on the recognition that the only thing that interrupted Dexter's pattern, the code, Harry's intervention, didn't actually interrupt it. It just delayed it and redirected it into a slightly different channel, And the question the season is actually asking is whether there's something Harrison can do that's more genuinely interruptive, whether the cycle can actually stop rather than just find a new form. Deborah Morgan. If you've watched the full series, you already have a complicated relationship with this character. Most people do. And I think the thing that makes her arc so difficult to watch, in the later seasons especially, is that the show is honest about what her love for Dexter actually costs her. It doesn't soften it. It doesn't resolve it into something more comfortable. It follows the thread all the way to its end. Let me back up, because to understand where Deborah ends up, you need to appreciate where she begins. She starts the series as a vice detective trying to get into homicide. Talented and ambitious, with a directness that her colleagues sometimes read as abrasiveness and an emotional openness that makes her easy to underestimate. Her relationship with Dexter is the foundation of who she is. He's the person she trusts most in the world, her anchor in the most literal sense. And across 8 seasons, that anchor slowly pulls her under. There's a line Deborah delivers at some point in season 7 that I find the most honest sentence in the show. She tells Dexter that she loves him and she wishes she didn't, not that she's stopped loving him, not that the revelation about who he is has canceled the feeling, just that she wishes she could cancel it and she can't. That's not dramatic writing, that's accurate. Season 6's finale is the turning point. Deborah walks into a church and sees Dexter completing a kill. The whole tableau. Everything she's been not quite knowing for years, suddenly impossible to not know. And what season 7 does with that moment is, I think, the most honest sequence the show produces about what it looks like to learn something true and catastrophic about someone you love. She doesn't call it in, she doesn't leave, she doesn't arrive immediately at a clean position. She oscillates, she tries to impose conditions. She'll monitor him, she'll manage the situation, she'll find a framework that lets her live with it. She tries several frameworks in sequence. None of them hold entirely, but she keeps building them because the alternative, that she loves someone she cannot reconcile with her own values, is not a thing she knows how to stop doing. There's real psychological accuracy to that oscillation. Popular culture tends to present the moment of revelation, the discovery that someone you love is not who you thought, as a clear pivot, a before and an after, a decision made. But in practice, you learn something true and terrible about a person you love, and you spend a long time figuring out what it means and what you're going to do about it. The answer keeps changing depending on the day and what just happened and how tired you are. Deborah's season 7 is the messy version, the Tuesday version, not the narrative version. And then the Lagerta situation arrives, and everything after that is a version of someone who has crossed a line and knows it. She shoots Lagerta to protect Dexter and herself, in the sense that her complicity goes with him if he goes down. And the person she is after that moment is not the person she was before it. Some knowledge of yourself, once acquired, is very difficult to put back. She doesn't survive the show. And the manner of her death, shot by a serial killer while trying to arrest him, suffering a stroke from the complications, being taken off life support by Dexter himself, is the show completing an argument it began in season 1. The people who love Dexter most pay the highest price. That's not a side effect of the story, that's the story. Jennifer Carpenter is extraordinary in this role throughout, and particularly across season 7. There's a rawness to certain scenes, the collapse and rebuild of her emotional responses. That gives the show more weight than the scripts alone would provide. And that rawness is worth mentioning, even just briefly, because it's part of why the character lands the way she does. I've always thought Deborah deserves her own full-length video, and I do plan to do one. Tonight she gets the chapter she's owed within this larger conversation. But the full accounting of what she gave this franchise would take considerably longer than this. Before we move on from Deborah, and we should because there's a lot of ground left, I want to say one more thing about the structure of her arc that I find genuinely interesting from a craft perspective. The show uses Deborah, across its entire run, as a moral compass for the audience. When Deborah accepts something about Dexter, we're invited to accept it. When she's troubled, we're invited to be troubled. Her emotional responses give us our permission structure for how to feel about what we're watching, which means at the Lagerta moment, the moment she crosses from troubled witness to active participant in harm, is also the moment the show is withdrawing the permission structure it's been providing. After that, we don't have Deborah's acceptance to rely on. We're on our own with it. and I think that's deliberate, and quite brave for a show that had spent 6 seasons making itself comfortable to watch despite its uncomfortable subject matter. The last season, with Deborah diminished and damaged and moving toward her own death, is the show insisting on the accounting it had been deferring. The bill coming due, not as punishment, and the show is never quite that mechanical, but as the natural consequence of the shape of things. What unconditional love at the cost Deborah paid looks like in the end. I want to talk about James Dokes because I think he's one of the most instructive characters in the franchise and one of the most underappreciated. From the very first episode, Dokes watches Dexter with a hostility that seems disproportionate to anything Dexter has actually done. He questions his whereabouts. He challenges his conclusions. He doesn't engage in the performative camaraderie that holds the department together. He just stares at Dexter with barely contained suspicion and doesn't explain himself. Most of Dokes' colleagues interpret this as personality. He's abrasive. He's former Special Forces, and that does something to a person. He just doesn't like Dexter for whatever subjective reason, normal friction. Dexter's internal monologue addresses it directly, and the question he asks himself is genuinely revealing. In a building full of detectives, all of them trained to read people, all of them professional investigators, why is Dokes the only one who gets the creeps from him? The answer the show eventually provides is specific and important. Dokes served in Army Special Forces. He conducted operations in places where the rules of engagement were, to put it carefully, not what they are in civilian life. He has killed people, not as a serial killer, but in service, in war, in contexts where taking a life was sanctioned but not uncomplicated. And because of that background, he possesses a frame of reference that his Miami Metro colleagues don't have. He knows what it looks like when someone has taken a life and felt something about it that they shouldn't have felt. He recognizes the shape of it. And when Dokes looks at Dexter, he sees that shape, not the specifics, not the kill room or the blood slides or the code, the outline, the quality of someone who is carrying something that the other people in the building simply aren't. He can't prove any of this. He can't articulate it in terms that would survive professional scrutiny. But he's correct, completely, entirely, unambiguously correct. And what I find valuable about Dokes, outside the drama of his arc, which ends badly, is the question his existence raises about how we respond to people who make us uncomfortable. Dokes is not charming. His suspicion comes out rough and confrontational without the softening language that would make it easier to receive. His manner makes it easy for everyone around him to dismiss the content of what he's noticing. Dexter uses it, Deborah uses it, LaGuerta uses it. Everyone at various points treats Dokes' hostility as a personality flaw rather than as information. He was also correct the entire time. Those two things coexisted, difficult to be around and right about the most important thing. That combination is genuinely common. Most of us have had versions of this person in our lives. Someone whose manner made it easy to discount them, whose accuracy got lost in the friction of how they delivered it. The person nobody liked who was nevertheless noticing something real. Dokes ends Season 2 framed as the Bay Harbor butcher and killed in a cabin explosion that Lila orchestrates. He's exonerated posthumously, but in the quiet way that posthumous exonerations happen, a revision of the record that doesn't quite undo the damage. His signature line, "Surprise, motherfucker," becomes the title of the Season 7 finale, the episode where LaGuerta comes closest to proving what Dokes knew all along. A small acknowledgement from the show's writers, a nod. It's not enough, but it's something. There's a specific loneliness in Dokes' position that the show touches on, but doesn't fully explore. And I think about it sometimes. He's the person who is correct about the most important thing and can neither prove it nor be taken seriously about it. The mechanism that makes him easy to dismiss, his abrasiveness, his intensity, his way of making the suspicion feel personal rather than professional, is in some ways a product of the same formation that gave him the perceptive capacity in the first place. His Special Forces background gave him the eyes to see Dexter clearly. It also gave him the manner that made everyone else look away from what he was seeing. Those two things come from the same place and he can't separate them. That's a particular kind of trap. Watching him be caught in it across the first 2 seasons is one of the things that makes those seasons hold up so well on a rewatch. He's not a victim of bad luck, exactly. He's a victim of the gap between perception and credibility. between being right and being believed. I'd also note that Dokes had every right to be angry with Dexter, not just suspicious, angry. His instincts were being gaslit, professionally and socially. He was being made to feel unreasonable for perceiving something real. That experience of knowing something true and being treated as though your knowing of it is the problem is genuinely maddening, and Dokes, to his credit, never stopped knowing it just because it was costing him. There's something in that, even if the show never quite frames it that way. This one doesn't trace to a single episode. It's a pattern across the whole franchise, and I think it deserves to be looked at as a pattern rather than a collection of incidents. Lagerta, Dokes, Frank Lundy, who was an honest investigator following an honest investigation and got killed for it. Rita, who met Dexter at a support group and chose to rebuild her life around him. Aster and Cody, Rita's children from her first marriage, who lost a mother and a stepfather in ways they were never told the truth about. Harrison, who grew up largely alone following events he didn't choose and couldn't have understood. Masuka, whose professional reputation was built on forensic analyses that his own colleague was manipulating from the inside. None of these people made an informed choice to be in the blast radius. They were near Dexter, through work, through love, through circumstance, when the consequences arrived. They didn't sign up for the risk, they didn't get to weigh it, they just happened to be close. The show doesn't let Dexter fully rationalize this, and I think that's one of its more honest qualities. He tries. His internal monologue is full of attempts to contain the harm in his framing, to position it as unavoidable, or as the price of a larger good, or as something those people would have understood if they could have known the full picture. And occasionally the show lets him get away with it long enough to keep the drama moving. But the moments that actually land, the moments that stay with you, are the ones where the frame breaks and the math is visible. Lagerta's arc is the one I keep returning to in this context. She was arguably the most professionally credible of the people who suspected the truth about Dexter, and she's often discussed as either a villain or a secondary character depending on the season. But what she actually was across the later seasons is a detective who refused to close a case she believed had been closed wrongly. She was protecting a dead colleague's reputation. She was following evidence. She was doing her job carefully and persistently in the face of institutional pressure to leave it alone. And she died for it. She didn't choose to be collateral damage. She just happened to be competent. That's the specific tragedy of her arc. Not that she was wrong about anything, not that she was naive about anything, but that being right and being thorough brought her into collision with something she hadn't chosen to be near. I find this the hardest aspect of the franchise to sit with comfortably, honestly. Not the killings. The show creates enough dramatic distance from those that they're manageable. But this pattern, the accumulation of people who were changed, diminished, or destroyed simply by being near someone carrying something they didn't know about. That registers differently. That feels less like fiction and more like something that actually happens in the world, in smaller forms, with less dramatic framing. The harm that radiates outward from a concealed self isn't always intentional. It's often not. And unintentional harm is, in a lot of ways, harder to reckon with than deliberate harm because there's no clean accountability for it. Dexter never wanted to hurt Rita. He never wanted Dokes to die framed for his crimes. He never wanted Harrison in that bathtub. None of that wanting made any difference to the outcome. There's something the show does quietly across the seasons that I think is worth naming. It gives the secondary characters enough interiority that you can feel the weight of what each of them loses. Rita gets full episodes exploring her perspective. Deborah's grief is given space. Even Lagerta, who is initially presented primarily as an antagonist, gets enough depth in the later seasons that her death in season 7 is genuinely affecting rather than simply dramatic. The show is insisting through that treatment that these people are not just furniture in Dexter's story. They have their own stories, their own costs. Masuka is perhaps the one exception. He's kept largely in comic relief territory throughout, and I've always found that slightly regrettable. He's the colleague who trusts Dexter most professionally, whose work is most consistently reliant on Dexter's integrity, and whose trust is most completely misplaced. There's something more interesting available in that than the show usually pursues. But the pattern itself is clear. The show keeps showing you the cost. In different registers, with different characters, it doesn't let you forget it. If you're enjoying this and you haven't already, there is a subscribe button below that would help this channel keep going. Genuinely appreciated, as always. But let's continue. Lumen Pierce arrived in Season 5 as a survivor, which is a description that does her arc both justice and insufficient justice simultaneously. She'd been taken by a group of men, wealthy, connected, protected from consequences by money and influence, who used that protection to hurt women. She escaped. She was, at the start of the season, in a state that the show depicts with more care than you might expect. Not collapsed, not already healed, but somewhere in between. Functional, carrying something enormous, not sure what to do with it. Her relationship with Dexter develops from wariness to alliance to something harder to categorize. She wants help finding and confronting the men who hurt her. Dexter, who is raw and unmoored following Rita's death, finds in that purpose something his grief doesn't otherwise provide. They're useful to each other in specific, non-interchangeable ways, and then, gradually, improbably, something more real develops. Not utility, but presence. Not partnership, but genuine accompaniment. The relationship works, I think, because the show is honest about what it is and what it isn't. It's not a love story in the conventional sense. It's two people whose particular damage happens to be complementary. She has a dark passenger, briefly, because of what was done to her. And he has the skills that her dark passenger requires, and they find each other at the precise moment when both of those things are true simultaneously. That's a specific kind of connection. It's not nothing. And then the last episode of Season 5 does something I find genuinely graceful. Lumen's dark passenger fades, the men are dead. The purpose is complete, and she tells Dexter with honesty and without cruelty that she doesn't need to stay, she doesn't want to. Not because she doesn't care about him or she'll say the show makes clear that she does. But because the thing that brought her to this specific place is finished, and she's ready to walk away from it and live. She packs her bags, she goes. No betrayal, no dramatic revelation that changes the terms, no tragic ending. It just concludes the way some things genuinely conclude. Not because they went wrong, but because they went right and then they were complete. There's a kind of relationship that most of us don't have good language for, precisely because we've been trained to categorize endings as failures unless they end in permanence. But Lumen's departure is not a failure, it's a completion. Dexter's internal monologue in that final episode of Season 5 has a line that I've thought about quite a bit. He says, reflecting on what they had, "Lumen made me believe there was hope for me." And then, after she leaves, "But wishes are for children. The hope doesn't last. His nature reasserts itself. The window opened and then closed, but the window was real. That matters." The season closes at Harrison's first birthday party on the beach. Dexter surrounded by people who care about him, for once not entirely performing. He quietly removes his wedding ring, the first time he's done so since Rita died. He looks around at the people assembled, couples and friendships, and the ordinary texture of other people's lives, and he sits with the gap between that and what he is. It's a quiet scene. No revelation, no drama, no forward momentum. Just a man at a birthday party trying to work out what he's left with. I like that the show allowed itself that quietness in that moment. It's easy to forget those moments exist in Dexter given how much noise surrounds them. There's one more thing about Lumen's departure that I want to say because I think it carries something important. When she tells Dexter she's leaving, one of the things he says to her is that he's sorry he couldn't give her what she needed. And she says, "You gave me exactly what I needed." The thing she needed was specific, it was real, and it's done. She's not leaving because she didn't get it. She's leaving because she did. That reframe is, I think, the most genuinely generous thing the show does with any relationship in its run. Most endings, on television, in fiction generally, in popular culture's understanding of relationships, are coded as failures unless they're permanent. The relationship that ends is the relationship that didn't work. But Lumen's departure is built on the opposite logic. It worked. That's why it's finished. The thing it needed to do, it did. And there's something in that about how we understand the people who are right for a specific chapter of our lives without being right for the whole book. Those relationships are real and important and genuinely formative. The fact that they're not permanent doesn't mean they failed. It might mean they succeeded on exactly the terms they were built for, and that there's a kind of grace in letting them complete cleanly instead of stretching them past their natural end. Dexter doesn't quite have that grace. He struggles with Lumen's leaving. But the show does, and that's worth something. I want to add one thing about Season 5 more broadly before we move on, because it tends to get undersold. It doesn't have the iconic villain of Season 4, or the structural stakes of Season 2, or the clean origin energy of Season 1. What it has is emotional honesty about grief and rebuilding that the more celebrated seasons don't quite offer in the same way. How you put your hands on something that feels like it matters when the structure of your life has just collapsed. That's what Season 5 is actually about, underneath the thriller plot. And it answers that question better than the show usually gets credit for. Season 6 is not the best season. I'll say that with the affection of someone who has watched the entire franchise more times than I'd admit to in most social situations. The religious iconography storyline strains in ways the show doesn't quite have the tools to resolve. And the twist regarding the relationship between Travis Marshall and Professor Geller is telegraphed clearly enough that when it lands, it doesn't land with the weight it needs. Season 6 has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 38%, which is, if anything, slightly generous. But the last few minutes of the Season 6 finale do something that matters for the whole franchise's shape. Deborah follows a lead, unrelated to Dexter, just a homicide investigation, and walks into a church. And there she finds Dexter, mid-ritual, with Travis Marshall on a table, the plastic wrap in place, the whole architecture of his other life visible and unavoidable. She actually sees it for the first time. After 6 seasons of near misses and almost knowings, the thing she's been orbiting without landing on is simply there in front of her. And what's interesting about that moment, rewatching it, is that it doesn't feel like a shock. It feels, in retrospect, inevitable. Because Deborah has been in a state of perpetual, almost knowledge for years. She's been the person closest to Dexter. She's been following threads that lead toward his real life, over and over, and then stopping herself before they resolve. Not because she lacks the intelligence to follow them through, but because following them through would require acting on what they revealed. And not knowing until that moment is consistently more manageable than knowing would be. We do this, not with serial killers in churches, but with the broader pattern. There are things we know about the people close to us, about situations we're in, about choices we've been making, that we've made a sustained effort to not quite know, because knowing would require something of us. Because not knowing is the less demanding option, right up until the moment it isn't. The Season 6 finale is just the moment when Deborah's not knowing becomes impossible. The information is in the room. She's in the room. There's no more distance available. It's a short observation, relatively speaking, but I think it earns its place in this conversation. The work of not knowing is, in most cases, considerably more effortful and costly than the work of knowing would be. The effort is invisible while it's happening. The cost becomes visible only when it stops being possible. Season 7 is what the knowing looks like, and it's worth dwelling on. There's something else about this moment that I want to note, because I think it illuminates a dynamic that runs through the whole show. Deborah's sustained not knowing about Dexter isn't just denial. It's not simply self-protection. There's something more active happening in it, which is that Deborah, throughout the series, has consistently chosen to interpret ambiguous information about Dexter in the most benign direction available. When things didn't add up, she found explanations. When the evidence pointed somewhere she didn't want it to point, she found an angle that let her look away. That's not stupidity. Deborah is sharp. It's something closer to a form of loyalty, a choice made repeatedly over years to protect the relationship over the information. And that choice has a cost, as all choices do. The cost is that by the time she walks into that church, the gap between what she knows and what she's acknowledged is enormous. The distance between reality and her working version of events has been accumulating for years. There's a theory in psychology, not going to turn this into a lecture, don't worry, about the difference between what we actually perceive and what we allow ourselves to register. The idea being that people are sometimes more perceptive than they appear, and that what looks like obliviousness is sometimes something more like active management of what gets through. Deborah's relationship to the truth about Dexter strikes me as an illustration of that. She managed what got through for a very long time. The interesting thing about the season 6 finale then is not just that the information becomes available, it's that the management becomes impossible. The scene removes the option, she's in the room, the thing is visible. There's no angle to look at this from that doesn't include what it actually is. And then, in season 7, the management becomes a different project. Instead of managing the information so it doesn't arrive, she's managing what to do with information that has arrived and cannot be put back. Different work, harder work, the kind of work that, as we'll talk about shortly, took more from her than anything she'd given the management project over the previous 6 seasons. Season 7 picks up immediately after the season 6 finale, and the first thing it does, and this is the thing I think is genuinely brave for a show of this type, is refuse to resolve the tension quickly. Deborah doesn't call it in, she doesn't make a clean decision in the first episode and move forward. She doesn't arrive at a position. What she does across the opening episodes is something that looks less like a plot development and more like a person trying to metabolize something that isn't metabolizable on any reasonable timeline. She oscillates, she's furious, then she's compassionate, then she's clinical, then she's destroyed again. She tries to impose structure on it. She'll monitor Dexter, she'll manage what he does, she'll establish rules. She makes him promise to go to therapy, she threatens to turn him in, and then doesn't. She tries one framework after another, each one slightly different, and none of them hold entirely, but she keeps building them because the alternative, accepting that she loves someone she cannot reconcile with herself, is not a thing she knows how to stop doing. What I find most honest about this is that it's messy, it's inconsistent. It doesn't move forward in a clean line. Popular culture tends to present the revelation moment, the discovery that someone you love is not what you believed, as a before and an after, a decision point. But most people who have had that experience will tell you it doesn't work that way. You learn something true and difficult about someone you love, and you spend a long time, sometimes a very long time, working out what it means and what you're going to do about it, and the answer keeps shifting depending on what day it is and how tired you are and what just happened and what you most need that day. Deborah's season 7 is the version of that process that doesn't get shown very often. The Tuesday version, not the narrative version. And then the LaGuerta situation builds to its inevitable point, and Deborah makes the choice she makes. She shoots LaGuerta to protect Dexter, and to protect herself from the consequences of everything she's done to shield him. The show is careful not to make this a purely selfless act. There's self-interest in it, but there's also love, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. What happens after that is a version of someone who knows themselves differently. Not worse, not better. Differently. Some things you do, once you've done them, become part of who you are in a way that can't be revised. Deborah lives with the LaGuerta decision for the remainder of the show, and it's visible in her. It's in the way she carries herself, the way she relates to Dexter, the specific quality of exhaustion that Jennifer Carpenter brings to the final season. There's something in her that she gave away and can't get back. I want to say something that might seem obvious, but I think is worth saying plainly. What the show gets right about this is that knowing the truth about someone changes the love, but it doesn't necessarily end it. It doesn't function as an off switch. The love is still present, only now it's present alongside the knowledge, and those two things have to share the same space, and neither of them fully accommodates the other. That condition, loving someone while knowing something true about them that you can't reconcile, is genuinely uncomfortable to live in. It's also more common than most people discuss openly. Deborah represents that condition at an extreme, but the shape of it is recognizable. To be fair to season 7, there's quite a lot else happening. Isaac Serco, the Koshka Brotherhood, the reintroduction of Hannah McKay, the Bay Harbor butcher case being reopened. All of that is interesting in its own ways, and Hannah particularly deserves proper attention, which I'll give her in a separate video. But the emotional center of season 7 is this: Deborah and what it costs to know what she knows. One specific aspect of season 7 that I want to pull out is the therapy angle. Deborah makes Dexter go to therapy, as a condition of her not turning him in, more or less. He has to engage with Dr. Evelyn Vogel, who, as we'll discuss in a moment, turns out to be much more entangled in Dexter's origin than anyone knew. But before that revelation, there's a stretch of episodes where Dexter is sitting in a therapist's office, being asked questions about his inner life, and having to navigate between honesty and performance in a context specifically designed to see through performance. It's one of the stranger and more interesting sections of the season because Dexter in therapy is Dexter in a room where his particular skill set, the maintenance of surfaces, the management of impressions, is being professionally interrogated. The therapy doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't change Dexter in the ways it might change most people. But it does something. It makes him articulate things he usually keeps internal, out loud to another person, even if that articulation is partial and managed. And Vogel in those sessions is clearly getting more from them than a standard therapeutic exchange would provide. She's gathering data, she's reconnecting with the subject of a long-standing professional interest. She's seeing what the code produced. The power dynamic in those sessions is considerably more complicated than it appears on the surface, and the season rewards close watching for exactly that reason. Season 8 introduces Dr. Evelyn Vogel, and the information she brings with her is quietly destabilizing in a way I find more interesting than most of Season 8's actual execution. The premise is this: Vogel was a neuropsychiatrist who worked alongside Harry Morgan during the years when Harry was trying to determine what to do about young Dexter. She helped him construct the code, not in a supportive advisory capacity, as a clinical co-architect. She had developed theoretical frameworks about psychopathy, about what people with Dexter's wiring were, what they needed, how they could be managed. Harry came to her with a problem, and she helped him design a solution informed by her professional conclusions. Dexter learns this after decades of understanding the code as a purely personal gift from his father, something built out of love for him specifically, shaped around his particular nature, given to him as an act of devotion. The discovery that it was also, in significant measure, a clinical experiment, that a professional had their own theoretical stake in how the code was constructed and how it functioned in practice, is not a small revision. It doesn't make Harry a villain. I want to be clear about that because the show is clear about it. Harry was genuinely trying to protect Dexter. The code was a real act of love, whatever else it was simultaneously. But it was also other things at the same time. It was Vogel's theory, tested on a child. It was Harry's need to believe that what he'd done was morally defensible. It was a design built by people with their own needs and interests and blind spots, handed to Dexter as truth and origin story. The version of events Dexter had been living with was edited, not dishonest necessarily. Harry probably couldn't have given Dexter the complete picture even if he'd wanted to, but shaped by what Harry was able to look at and what he wasn't, by what Vogel concluded and what she needed from the outcome, by what any person constructing a narrative about their own choices selects and leaves out. I find this concept interesting because it touches something fairly universal. The stories we have about how we became who we are were told to us largely by the people who shaped us. Those people were working with incomplete self-knowledge, with their own needs and investments and blind spots, with what they could bear to see and what they couldn't. The origin stories we've inherited are true and partial simultaneously. They capture something real about what happened. They also reflect the perspective of the person doing the telling. Growing up at some point involves developing the capacity to look at those stories with some additional complexity, not to indict the people who told them. Just to have a more complete picture, to hold the love that was in the code alongside the self-interest that was also in the code, and to understand that both were there from the beginning. Season 8 doesn't entirely do justice to this concept, if I'm being honest. It has structural problems. A season that keeps pivoting towards a conclusion that doesn't quite satisfy. And the Vogel material doesn't always get the space it deserves within those structural constraints. But the idea underneath it is rich, and Dexter sitting with the revised version of his own origin, older, further along, trying to figure out what it means that the framework he built his life around was built for reasons he wasn't told. That's real territory, not just for this show. There's also a detail about Vogel specifically that I find interesting, which is that she describes Dexter as a perfect psychopath. She says it with something that reads almost as pride, which is its own complicated moment. She helped build him in some sense, and she's looking at the product and finding it good. That framing, the person whose work you are looking at you and evaluating the quality of the work, is strange enough to register uncomfortably, and the show knows it. And what Dexter does with that framing across the last season is itself revealing. He doesn't accept it entirely. The perfect psychopath label is one he resists, not with anger, but with a quiet insistence that it doesn't capture the full picture. He has Harrison to think about. He has Hannah. He has, in some form, the desire for a future that doesn't end with him destroying everything he's built. The perfect psychopath doesn't have those things, or shouldn't. Whether he's right about himself is the question the finale is, in its own fumbling way, asking. And New Blood, a few years later, provides a different kind of answer than Season 8 managed to reach. New Blood opens in Iron Lake, New York, in deep winter, snow on everything, a small town, and a man named Jim Lindsay. Jim Lindsay works at a sporting goods store. He knows the regulars by name. He's on a bowling league. He's in a quiet relationship with the local police chief. He moves through his days without urgency, without the Miami energy, without the second life. By all visible measures, he is exactly who he appears to be. A gentle, mild-mannered man who has found a peaceful corner of the world and settled into it. His name is not Jim Lindsay. Dexter Morgan has been living this way for nearly a decade, having walked off a boat into a hurricane at the end of Season 8 and effectively erased himself. 10 years without a kill, without plastic wrap, without blood slides. The dark passenger, apparently by force of will and distance, suppressed. Not examined, not understood, not integrated. Suppressed. There's a white deer in the woods near his cabin that he's been watching for a while, feeding almost, maintaining a relationship with from a respectful distance. Something pure and rare that comes to him. Proof, in some private way, that he can be near beautiful things without destroying them. And then Matt Caldwell shoots the deer. Right in front of him. The kill happens that night. The first in a decade. And what I want to sit with here, because the show is careful about this, is how it frames that moment. It doesn't frame it as a failure of will. It doesn't present the dark passenger returning as some inevitable relapse. Though the parallel to addiction is hard to miss and probably intentional. It presents it as a response to something genuinely present. Matt Caldwell is a man who has caused real harm and been continuously shielded from consequences by his father's money. Something in Dexter's particular wiring is calibrated precisely to respond to that. The deer is dead, the calibration fires. 10 years of suppression didn't create immunity, it created delay. This is the most psychologically interesting thing New Blood does, and it does it in the first episode. The Jim Lindsay years are not presented as fraudulent. He built real habits, a real life, genuine relationships. The reinvention was real insofar as it went. It just didn't go the full distance because it never did the work of examining what it was reinventing from. It just put the dark passenger in a box and moved to a colder place. There's a distinction underneath this that I think is worth naming explicitly. The difference between suppression and integration. Suppression means putting the thing away and not engaging with it. Integration means acknowledging it fully, understanding where it comes from and what it does, and finding some genuine way to live with it that doesn't require pretending it isn't there. Those are different processes with different outcomes. Suppression works until it doesn't. Integration, if you can manage it, is more durable. Dexter never managed integration, in the original series or in New Blood. He managed suppression repeatedly and with some skill, and then lived with the consequences when the suppression broke down. And the most significant consequence of the dark passenger returning in Iron Lake is not the kill itself, it's Harrison. There's a softer version of this lesson that I want to offer because I think the harder version can land as bleak in a way that isn't quite the full picture, because there's also something genuine in the Jim Lindsay years. The fact that the dark passenger came back doesn't mean that decade was meaningless. Real relationships developed. A different kind of presence in the world was built. Things were learned, even if they were learned through suppression rather than examination. What the show suggests, and I think this is its most nuanced observation about change, is that partial transformation is still transformation. It just has limits that total transformation wouldn't have. Jim Lindsay was a partial version of whoever Dexter could have been with fuller integration of his own nature. And a partial version is still a version. It still counts for something. The tragedy of New Blood is not that Dexter tried and failed to change. It's that he tried the version of change that was available to him, the suppressive version, the box and geography version, and found its ceiling. There's also something worth saying about the specific choice of Iron Lake, a small town, cold, remote. He wasn't just changing his name and his habits. He was choosing a landscape that was, symbolically, the opposite of the one that shaped him. And it worked for those 10 years. The cold helped. The bowling league helped. Not because those things fixed anything, but because they provided enough friction against the dark passenger's requirements to keep it quiet. That's not nothing, it's actually quite a lot, as temporary solutions go. What New Blood shows is that you can't put enough physical distance between yourself and what you are, because what you are travels with you. The dark passenger didn't stay in Miami when Dexter left. It came north, it waited, and it came back not because Dexter ran out of distance, but because something arrived that matched its particular frequency perfectly. Harrison Morgan tracked Dexter down by following the trail of a bowling league Instagram post from a man named Fred, which is, and I mean this genuinely, one of the better details in the franchise. After a decade of careful erasure living under an assumed identity in a small town in upstate New York, Dexter's cover gets blown by recreational 10-pin bowling photography. Perfect. No notes. What Harrison had pieced together painstakingly and from considerable distance. Dexter had written a letter to Hannah after faking his death, and when Hannah died from pancreatic cancer, that letter eventually reached Harrison. It proved that his father was alive, not just alive and had been alive for years, and had let Harrison believe otherwise, had let him grow up through foster homes thinking he had no one. That detail is important to sit with. Harrison didn't find out Dexter was alive and immediately go to find him, or immediately forgive him, or immediately anything. He found out that the man who let him believe he was dead had been choosing that for years. And then he went to find him anyway. The first substantial conversation between them in Dexter's cabin in Iron Lake has a texture that I think is genuinely uncomfortable in a productive way. Dexter offers to make blueberry pancakes. Harrison tells him he's not 5 anymore. And then plainly without performance. No, growing up without a dad, that was hard. And opening up that letter, finding out you let me believe you were dead all those years, that was brutal. That's it. No collapse, no dramatic delivery, just the true sentence. And Dexter, who has spent his entire adult life navigating difficult social situations with extraordinary facility, who can manage crime scenes and police detectives and murderous antagonists, is almost entirely at a loss. The whole of Harrison's time in Iron Lake is built on that gap, not primarily the dark passenger storyline, which is the thriller element. The real subject is two people who have an enormous amount of unaddressed history between them, and almost no language for addressing it. Dexter doesn't know how to be a father, not in the ordinary way that parents sometimes don't know. In the specific way of someone whose emotional vocabulary was built entirely around concealment and management, not communication and presence. He keeps trying to protect Harrison. He keeps trying to keep Harrison at a useful distance. He does both simultaneously, which predictably serves neither goal. And Harrison, for his part, is 17 and carrying something in him that he doesn't understand and has been managing as shame. The impulse toward violence that showed up in his adolescence and that he doesn't have a framework for. He's drawn to Kurt Caldwell partly because Kurt is the first adult who seems to offer understanding without an agenda attached, who seems to see what Harrison is without flinching and to say, "That's okay. You're not broken." There's a specific kind of vulnerability that comes from being offered understanding without conditions when you've been carrying something alone for a long time. It overrides caution. It overrides better judgment. Harrison ignores Dexter's warnings about Kurt for longer than makes tactical sense, because what Kurt is offering hits the thing Harrison most needs. What I keep returning to about this storyline is the timing element. The conversations that Dexter and Harrison needed to have about the dark passenger, about what Harrison is carrying, about who Dexter actually is and what that means for who Harrison might be. Those conversations needed to happen years earlier, not in a perfect, idealized version, but in whatever imperfect, partial version was available. They didn't happen. The silence accumulated. And by the time they're both in Iron Lake with everything converging, the gap between them has a decade's worth of weight in it. Most genuinely difficult conversations between people who love each other have something like that dynamic. Not a decade of silence usually, but some period of avoidance that has added mass to what needs to be said. And the avoidance never makes the conversation easier. It just makes the eventual conversation more loaded, more fraught, and more necessary. Here's a small, strange detail worth noting. Dexter, upon first seeing Harrison at his cabin, tries to deny being Dexter Morgan. He tells his own son, who has come looking for him across significant distance, that he's the wrong person. He looks at this boy who looks like him and tells him he's mistaken. Harrison says simply, "You look just like I remembered." Dexter, who can maintain a double life for decades without breaking, can't maintain it for 30 seconds when the person on the other side of it is his own child. That tells you something? There's actually a poignancy in that specific failure that the show doesn't quite stop to name. For all the years of careful performance, the elaborate maintenance of the Jim Lindsay identity, the decade of invisible living, and then a teenager shows up at the door, and in half a minute, Dexter can't hold the lie. Because somewhere in him, whatever else is true, he didn't want to. The lie was technically available to him. The willingness to sustain it at that specific moment with that specific person was not. Kurt Caldwell is New Blood's central villain, and he's interesting for reasons that go a bit beyond the surface thriller function. On the surface, Kurt runs a successful trucking business in Iron Lake. He's a respected figure. People know him, like him, owe him favors. He has a reputation for generosity, for remembering names, for being present in the community, in the way that small-town pillars of the community are present. He takes an interest in young Harrison, offers him a job, talks to him the way adults rarely talk to teenagers. Directly, without condescension, without the nervous distance that most adults put between themselves and a kid they sense is in trouble. He seems to see Harrison clearly, and what he sees, he doesn't appear to fear. Underneath all of that, Kurt has been hunting and killing young women who came to Iron Lake in search of opportunity for years. He preserves their bodies in an underground facility. He is a predator who has learned to perform as a protector with impressive precision. The parallel to Harry is implicit and I think intentional. Both are older men who identified something specific in a younger person, a capacity for violence, a dark passenger of some kind, and decided to cultivate it rather than help it find another path. Harry shaped Dexter's dark passenger into a framework with rules and direction. Kurt's message to Harrison is different. Do what you want to do. No apologies. Stop punishing yourself for what you are. The difference between those two messages matters enormously. Harry's approach, for all its complicated motivations and its genuine failures, was oriented toward Dexter's survival. The code was a structure that allowed Dexter to exist in the world without destroying himself or the people around him. It was imperfect and built partly from Harry's own needs, as we've talked about, but it was aimed at something. It was trying to give Dexter a future. Kurt's message, accept the darkness, act on it without restraint, stop apologizing, is the absence of structure. It's permission without any accompanying framework. And the reason it's appealing to Harrison is exactly why it's dangerous. It requires nothing from him except to be what he already is. It asks nothing of him, it just validates. This is the thing about understanding that isn't necessarily care. Kurt understood Harrison's dark passenger with considerable accuracy. He identified it quickly, named it correctly, and responded to it without flinching. All of that reads, from Harrison's perspective, as genuine insight, as being truly seen. But understanding your darkness and caring about your future are not the same thing. They can coexist. Harry is the example of that. But they don't automatically. Kurt wasn't trying to keep Harrison alive. He wasn't invested in what Harrison became or who Harrison got to be. He was using Harrison's vulnerability as something that alleviated something in his own psychology. That's not mentorship. It's a different arrangement wearing mentorship's clothes. The distinction is genuinely hard to see from the inside, especially when you're 17 and carrying something you don't understand and someone older and calmer looks at you and says, "You're fine. You're not broken. I understand what you are and it doesn't frighten me." That feels like love the first time you encounter it. And sometimes it is. And sometimes it's something else entirely, and the only way to tell the difference is to look at what the person offering it seems to want from the arrangement. Kurt Caldwell, it turned out, had a room full of preserved bodies as his answer to that question. There's something useful in the contrast between how Dexter relates to Harrison and how Kurt does in these early episodes of New Blood. Dexter's trying to protect Harrison by keeping him at arm's length, By not sharing the full picture, by managing the information Harrison has access to, by trying to give Harrison a version of the Iron Lake life that doesn't include its most dangerous elements. That approach fails, but it comes from a place of genuine care about Harrison's outcome. Kurt's approach is the opposite. He shares everything with Harrison, he offers full access, full validation, full presence. He doesn't manage the information or protect Harrison from anything. He just opens the door and invites Harrison through. And what's waiting through the door is not Harrison's well-being, it's Kurt's. The difference between those two approaches isn't obvious from the outside, especially when you're in Harrison's position. One looks like withholding, the other looks like openness. But they have completely different orientations. One is trying to protect you, the other is trying to use you. And the way you can tell them apart is by asking, over time, what the person offering them seems to be getting from the arrangement. Dexter, imperfectly and with significant fumbling, was trying to give Harrison something. Kurt was trying to take something. That distinction gets lost when you're 17 and lonely and someone finally seems to see you without flinching. But it's there, and it matters. The New Blood finale is one of the more debated endings in the franchise's history, and I want to give it proper space because I think the debate sometimes misses what the show actually did. Let me back up to what precipitates it. Dexter kills Logan, a police officer in Iron Lake, not a killer, not someone on the code's list. Someone who got in the way of Dexter's escape route, an innocent. The line the code explicitly prohibited for its entire existence, crossed in a moment of survival calculation. Harrison finds out, not from Dexter's careful, managed version, the full thing. And Harrison, who has spent the season trying to understand his father, trying to find the framework that makes sense of what Dexter is, trying to figure out whether there's a way to accommodate this in his own life, asks the most devastating question available. He asks whether his mother would still be alive if it wasn't for Dexter, whether Deborah would still be alive. He doesn't need Dexter to answer, they both know the answer. And Dexter's response is what I've been thinking about since New Blood aired. He doesn't defend himself, he doesn't construct a framework, he doesn't invoke the code or the dark passenger or the mitigating circumstances of a life lived under impossible pressure. He tells Harrison to take the safety off the gun. He says it's the only way out. And then he stands still and waits. He means this, not as resignation and not exactly as sacrifice either, as an honest accounting. He is the vector for the harm. The pattern of damage runs through him, forward and backward to his parents' generation and his sons. And Harrison, who carries the same thing in him, who is at the beginning of his life and not the end of it, deserves the chance to end the pattern rather than continue it. That's what Dexter's offering, not his death as punishment, his death as the one genuinely protective thing he has left to give. Harrison shoots him. Dexter's last words to his son are, "You did good. I know some people found this unsatisfying. I've heard the arguments that Dexter deserved more active agency in his own ending, that a different conclusion would have honored the character's arc more fully, that the show pulled its punch somewhere in the final episodes, and the finale bears the weight of that. Those aren't wrong arguments. The season has genuine structural problems in its final movement, but the ending itself, stripped of those problems, does something I find genuinely honest. Dexter has wanted, throughout the franchise, for the people he loves to survive him. He kept failing at this. Rita didn't survive. Deborah didn't survive. Harrison nearly didn't, multiple times, and each near miss was a direct consequence of Dexter's presence in the world. The ending gives him one thing he never managed to provide while fully living, a choice that actually protects his son. He can't be the father Harrison needed. He can't undo what he is or what he's caused. What he can do is stop being the thing Harrison is trying to survive. And he chooses that. There's a version of love that looks like that, not the comfortable version, not the version that stays and tries and forgives and rebuilds. The version that says, I know what I cost and I am removing the cost. It's not heroic in the traditional sense. It doesn't feel triumphant. But it's honest, and in the terms of this particular show, that might be the most it could offer. Angela, the police chief, arrives at the scene and finds Harrison standing over Dexter's body. She considers the circumstances, weighs what justice would look like here, and makes her decision. She hands Harrison some cash, tells him to leave Iron Lake and never come back, and watches him go. It's not a legal resolution, it's a human one. Harrison drives out of Iron Lake in the final scene, past the scene of what just happened, past the town he arrived in not long ago. He keeps driving. The letter Dexter wrote to Hannah is in the truck with him. Whatever comes next for Harrison is not something the show depicts. And I think that's right. His story isn't over, it's just beginning on the other side of the thing that was blocking it. There's something worth sitting with in Angela's choice before we move on. She had every legal and professional reason to arrest Harrison. He'd just shot someone. The circumstances were exceptional, but the act was clear, and she chose not to. She looked at a 17-year-old who had just killed his father to end a cycle of harm, and she decided that the justice system was not the appropriate instrument for this particular moment. That choice is its own kind of thesis statement, I think. A quieter one than the big finale moment, but connected to it. The show ends, in both its original run and New Blood, with institutions failing to deliver justice in any clean way. Lagerta, who was trying to pursue justice through proper channels, was killed for it. Harrison, who stopped a much larger harm, is let go by the one representative of institutional authority who had the power to hold him. The show doesn't quite endorse vigilantism. It spends its entire run cataloging its costs. But it also doesn't endorse institutional justice as a reliable alternative. It ends in a messy human space where neither option is satisfactory, and someone just has to make a call and live with it. Angela makes her call, Harrison drives away, the dark passenger stops here for now. A note for completeness, Dexter. Resurrection subsequently reveals that Dexter survived the gunshot wound and was resuscitated. That's its own story, and an interesting one in its own right. But for tonight, I'm going to let New Blood's ending stand as an ending. I think it deserves that. I've been talking for a while now, and I want to use this last main section to pull together the thread that runs through all of it. Because the thing that keeps surfacing across all of it, the original series and New Blood and Original Sin and the prequel and the continuation, is not a question about serial killing. It's a question about damage, about what you do with the version of yourself that arrived, partly or entirely, through no choice of your own. Shaped by genetics or by trauma or by the code someone built for you before you had any say in it, or by the wound that happened too early for you to have had the tools to manage it. Dexter Morgan is an extreme case. Obviously, the show is a thriller, not a guide to anything. But the questions underneath the drama are ones that most people are navigating in some form, at some level, with varying degrees of awareness. Who made me this way? What do I owe to that version of myself? What do I owe to the people near me? Can I be the thing I am and something else simultaneously? And when those two things become incompatible, when the self I've constructed and the self I actually am can no longer coexist in the same space, what do I do then? Deborah asked that question and answered it by staying. It cost her everything. Brian Moser never asked it at all. He had no Harry, no framework, no relationship to the world that would have made the question feel available to him. Miguel Prado asked it and answered it by deciding the question was less important than what he could take while the window was open. Harry asked it and answered it by constructing a system elaborate enough to protect him from sitting with the real version of the answer. Arthur Mitchell is perhaps the most complete illustration of what happens when the question is never asked. He spent 30 years recreating the same wound in ritual form, each murder a repeat of the same pattern, and nothing he built, not the church, not the family, not the homes he constructed for strangers, touched the thing that was actually driving him. It kept moving, it kept finding new expressions, and the people nearest to him absorbed the cost of his not asking. And Dexter asks the question. He asks it continuously and with genuine anguish throughout the franchise. He never fully resolves it, and I think that's the most honest thing the show does in the end. Because most people don't fully resolve it either. Most people live with it. They manage it imperfectly through relationships and work and the daily accumulated choices of a life. They hurt people they didn't mean to reach. They protect people they love in ways that sometimes backfire. They carry their dark passengers in whatever room they've built for them, and they go to work and they come home and they try. What I think the show earns by the end of New Blood is a modest but real statement. The trying matters even when it fails, even when the failure has consequences that can't be undone. Harry tried. The code was imperfect and built from mixed motivations and ultimately couldn't contain what it was trying to manage. But Harry tried. Dexter tried, imperfectly and with enormous collateral damage for most of his adult life. And in the end, the most trying thing he did was the last thing, standing still and letting Harrison have the chance at a different story. That's not a redemption arc. It's not a victory. It's something smaller and more durable than either of those. It's just someone finally doing the one thing available to them that might actually help. Here's what I keep coming back to. And then I'll let you get some rest. The franchise is called Dexter, after a person whose relationship with his own nature is the central drama. But the show is equally about everyone around him and what their presence in his life costs and gives them. It's about the people who loved him, the people who saw through him, the people who got caught in the blast radius of what he was. And all of those people were doing some version of the same thing he was, trying to figure out how to live with themselves inside the particular life that had been handed to them with the tools available. The tools are always imperfect. The life is always partly not what you chose. The trying is always going to fall short in some specific ways that you couldn't predict when you started. That's just what it is. And the show, at its most honest, is saying yes, and also you keep going anyway. Not because the outcome is guaranteed, because what else are you going to do? Dexter keeps going. Harrison drives away and keeps going. Deborah, until she couldn't, kept going. Even Harry, whose going ended in the way it ended, was going for a long time before it did. The franchise's most persistent quality, across all its seasons and continuations and 20 years of storytelling, is a refusal to conclude that trying is pointless, even when the evidence for pointlessness keeps mounting, even when the collateral damage is significant. The characters keep going and the show keeps following them because the alternative is to stop asking the question. And the question, whatever else you might say about it, is worth asking. That's what I mean when I say the show is honest about certain things. Not honest about forensics or police procedure or the operational logistics of serial killing. Not remotely on any of those. But honest about the texture of people trying to manage themselves in the world. It gets that right. More often than you'd expect from a show of its type. And somewhere in all of that, in the trying and the failing and the carrying on and the eventual quiet recognition of what the trying costs, there's something that I think earns the show its place in the conversation. Not because it's resolved anything. Dexter doesn't resolve anything by the end. It just looks at the material it has honestly and without flinching and follows it where it goes. That's a rarer quality in long-form television than it should be. And there's one more thing I want to say about the franchise as a whole, which is about Original Sin specifically and what it adds to this picture. Original Sin, the prequel series set in 1991 Miami, shows us the very beginning of the code in action. Young Dexter, played by Patrick Gibson, making his first kills under Harry's guidance. Harry, played by Christian Slater, trying to steer something he's not entirely sure he can steer. The narrator for Original Sin is Michael C. Hall's voiceover, the adult Dexter looking back at his younger self, which is a wonderful structural choice because it means the entire prequel is framed as memory and retrospection. The adult Dexter narrating his own origin, knowing where it all leads. What that framing does, and I find this quietly moving, is fold the whole franchise into a single act of looking back. The adult Dexter, somewhere in time, telling the story of how he began. Not defensively, not with the purpose of justifying anything, but just as a fact of who he is and where he came from. Here is the container. Here is Harry. Here is the first time I followed the code. Here is how it started. There's something generous in that framing if you receive it that way. The prequel is the franchise saying, we know how this ends. We know the full weight of what this origin produces. And we're looking at it anyway. Not to explain it away, not to forgive it, just to understand it as completely as possible. That's as good a description of what the whole franchise is doing as any I can offer, so that's where I'll leave it tonight. I've been working my way through this franchise across several videos now, and I keep being surprised by the same thing. There's something that makes Dexter last, beyond the performances and the thriller architecture and the genuinely great seasons. It's the emotional honesty that lives underneath the drama. The show is not, at its core, about what it looks like to be a serial killer. It's about what it looks like to be someone trying to live with themselves inside a life that doesn't have a clean category for what they are. The serial killer element is just the machinery that makes that invisible struggle visible. Most of us are not Dexter Morgan, but most of us know what it is to carry something that we didn't choose, to perform a version of ourselves that feels slightly removed from the real thing, to love people in ways that sometimes cost them, to run from something and find it waiting at the next stop. The show knows those things. At its best, it knows them very well. I've thought, doing this video, about why certain pieces of fiction stay with you in a way that others don't. And I think the answer for me is that the ones that last are the ones that contain something true that you didn't know how to say before you encountered it. The ones that give you language for something you were already carrying. Dexter does that in its own lurid and melodramatic way. It gave a lot of people, myself included, a vocabulary for certain kinds of interior experience. The performed self, the concealed interior, the exhaustion of the gap between them. That doesn't get articulated directly very often. That's not a small thing, even from a show about a serial killer with a boat. And here's the thing about that boat, actually. The slice of life, which Dexter takes out periodically across the series, alone on the ocean, with Miami receding behind him. That boat is the only place in the show where Dexter is genuinely neither one thing nor the other. Not performing for colleagues, not managing a household, not running a kill, just out on the water in the in-between. It's the closest thing he has to a space that belongs to the real version of himself rather than either of his roles. The franchise ends in season 8 with Dexter driving his boat into a hurricane, a version of ending that is also a version of disappearing. And then, in New Blood, with him living in a landlocked town far from any ocean, something permanently given up. And I always think that detail is deliberate. Jim Lindsay doesn't have a boat. The in-between space, the place that was neither one thing nor another, is one of the things he left behind when he tried to reinvent himself. That's a small thing to end on, and probably not the most important thing in the franchise by any measure. But it's the kind of detail that stays with me. The boat. The one place he wasn't performing, gone. I've got quite a bit more Dexter content planned. A proper deep dive into Original Sin, the 1991 Miami prequel, Young Dexter under Harry's tutelage, the making of the code in real time, which I find genuinely interesting as a piece of prequel storytelling. There's something rich in watching the architecture of a life being built from the foundation up, knowing what it eventually produces. A dedicated Deborah video because everything I've said about her tonight barely scratches the surface of what she does across the full series. And at some point, a Hannah McKay video, which I've been looking forward to because Hannah is one of those characters the show almost does justice to and then doesn't quite, and I have things to say about that. But for tonight, this is more than enough. This was a long one, and you've been patient with it, and I hope some of it landed somewhere useful. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you're comfortable. I hope the room is dark enough and quiet enough, and that whatever you're carrying tonight feels a little lighter for having had some company. That's what this is for, really. A voice in the dark that knows the same shows you know and thinks about them the way you do. And if any part of tonight felt like that, then it did its job. If you're new here and you found any of this interesting, there's a subscribe button below, and it genuinely helps. The dark passenger can rest for now. Sweet dreams.